All right. So, good evening, everyone. I hope I'm audible and I hope everyone is in good spirits. So, let's just wait for a few students to log in. In the meantime, I'll actually discuss with all of you all, what the objective of today's session is. So, first, let's start with I want to describe essentially what problems students face when they're, trying to figure out what to do with VARC or trying to essentially solve reading comprehension. Right? I want to work in broad strokes first, and then we'll discuss what the actual problem is and how we can overcome it, if at all there is a way to overcome it. So, speaking about reading comprehension, now, like I said, one of the things that we would have to do is first describe the problem that we have. Now, in reading, we'll start with the basics, right? And this is assuming that we all have done some kind of reading comprehension before. But what is the inherent challenge to passages? In any exam, when we get a passage, we don't have a particular title or a subtitle, right? So we don't have any context. So one of the challenges that we have for this passage question type essentially is there is no context. And this is important because since there is no context, there is no frame of reference. We have to create that frame of reference, and it has to be as accurate a frame of reference as possible, right? It has to be accurate enough for us to answer questions off of it. So whenever you are going through the passage, essentially our mind first initially tries to figure out context. Okay. So this is one inherent challenge key in all of our reading comprehensions. We face this kind of a challenge. In the VA section also, we have passages, smaller passages. We face the same challenge. We don't have any context. So we are expected to develop or build what the context of the author could be. Right. Apart from this, the other challenges are, of course, we can have a difficult, maybe difficult vocabulary, or we can have, let's say, difficult or a new topic, something that you have not heard of, something that is challenging, maybe in the way the jargon of the subject is or the topic is. So we can have different reasons to make the passage more complicated to read. The other things that could make a passage more complicated to read is the length of the sentence. Right? We'll come back to these, but these are indicators of the level of difficulty of the author. Right? Okay, so for those of you who have to contribute, who have doubts to ask of me, you'll have to subscribe so that you can access our chat window, and that way you can ask me your doubts. But yes, so we will discuss some specific topics that students have in mind with regards to challenges to VARC. Coming back to these three, these are indicators of the level of difficulty of your reading comprehension or whatever you read in the exam. The kind of vocabulary that is used, if the topic is approachable, and the length of sentences. This will approximate the kind of input that would be required from your end. How much effort would it take for you to figure out the passage? All right. So for us to figure out what, and that's the basics of why a passage is difficult. But really, what is expected of us in this exam or in these type of reading comprehension exams is something that we should figure out before we simply start solving questions. A lot of times what happens, especially with the reading comprehension or the verbal part of the paper, is that it's fairly obvious to us why quants or logical reasoning are needed, but why verbal is needed is not as fairly obvious to us, especially because of the kind of questions that are asked in the exam. Sometimes we feel that it's simply testing our English skills, but actually, if you notice, especially CAT, but all of these leading exams are not simply looking at our English skills. They're actually looking at our critical ability to critically analyze information, right? So critically analyze here does not mean criticize. This means, can you evaluate a given passage, right? So this is what is being tested. Essentially, that is what they're asking for. But let's look at the ways. Let's see the ways in which they approach, like the exams approach this subject, right? Just give me one moment. All right. So let's figure out a way in which, and like I said, I welcome your comments. Please tell me what you have to ask, etc. All right. So from the point of view of the exams, let's for a moment put aside the term VARC because this is CAT specific. But from the point of view of all of these difficult type of exams that we can consider, let's say verbal aptitude exams expect us to get better at what skills are we exactly practicing. So let's say exams like CAT, ZAT, GMAT, etc. Right? Exams which expect us to evaluate information and read critically. What do all these exams expect us to get better at? Simply evaluating information. This is a very generic goal. This does not tell me what I should practice every day, right? What skills are exactly we are supposed to practice? So again, another question that we need to focus on rather than simply solving question answer and expecting some kind of linear growth to happen in our accuracy is not ideal, right? We need to figure out what skill we are specifically trying to improve. So let's look at the questions that these type of exams ask. Just give me one more moment. All right. So to get to what I was saying, let's look at the kind of questions they're asking in these type of exams. Main idea questions. They'll ask us the main idea of the passage. Factual questions. These are straightforward. We understand what is expected from these questions. Then inference type questions, vocabulary context questions. Inferences, we know what inferences are, but quickly to define an inference is to put two facts together and come up with a new fact, or to come up with a new fact from an existing fact. Right? Let's take dark clouds in the sky and water in the streets, and we put this together to infer that it has rained. Correct? This is what an inference question expects us to do. Use fact or facts in the passage and come up with some new fact. Right? That's an inference. We have vocabulary. So these are the type of questions that are asked. Purpose. What is the purpose of given information? What is the function of the second paragraph? Right? Author's tone or attitude. What is the tone taken by the author? How is the information in the passage structured or organized? Application based questions. How would the author likely respond? Correct? Critical reasoning questions. Here we are being asked which of the following best supports the author's argument, which of the following, if true, would weaken the author's main argument. Multiple answer questions, etc. Right? Paraphrasing or summary questions, comparison questions, and so on and so forth. So what do you think exactly the exam expects us to do? Right? I mentioned at the start, we need this ability to simplify and evaluate, right? Simplify any passage. Any passage implies, as far as we don't really have any control over it. So of any length, any subject, right? With any kind of English language. It could be some deep jargon about using some deep jargon about some subject, or it could be a very general, vocabulary. We don't know. But in any case, any kind of passage we would be expected to simplify, and we would be able to then we would be expected to evaluate information. Right? This is what I told you. So what do all these exams expect us to get better at? There are specific skills that are expected from us, and this is what I'm talking about, and which is why I think like this class should be of extreme value to students, those of you who are actually struggling to achieve just falling short of their target scores in some way. Because what is required is not simply us solving question answer, but making sure our fundamentals are in check, right? Our fundamentals are working fine. So make sure that I suggest that there will be ample opportunity for you to do so, but make sure that you take a look at this video later as well. And I want us to discuss these ideas in another class that I have planned. But let's start by discussing these two ideas, and we'll actually practice one specific skill, and hopefully it will bring us improvements across the board in all of our VARC questions, right? In any type of exam, any reading comprehension type of question, we'll hopefully get better at if we practice one specific kind of skill, right? That is the hypothesis. Let's see if this works. So let's look at the skills that the exam expect us to be good at, right? Active reading and comprehension. There are two fundamental skills, right? Active reading and comprehension. Now let's think of what this means. Reading the text critically and thoughtfully. These actually, when I tell a student read a text critically, read a text thoughtfully, these don't really make sense, right? We understand that these are our goals, but what does that imply? What action am I supposed to take? This is not exactly told by most of the instructions that we have for anything to do with verbal or VARC or anything to do with reading. And the reason why the instructions are like this is, again, not any criticism, but it's inherent to the discipline, right? We are expected to simplify and evaluate, which means we are expected to read critically. But how to actually read critically? How do I weigh one piece of information versus another piece of information, right? For active reading and comprehension will help us out with main idea questions. It will help us out with vocabulary questions. It will help us out with function or purpose questions. It will help us out structure, organization, etc. It will help us essentially active reading and comprehension. If you were present at the start of class, we went through some question types, right? Some question types which are frequently asked in the verbal sections of all of these exams, like CAT, ZAT, GMAT, etc. Right? These sort of application based questions that we see. So what I'm trying to posit here, that if there is a specific skill that we practice, we can probably get better at all the question types that are involved in this reading part of the exam, right? So let's figure out what those skills are. But before we figure out what those skill or that skill is, we'll actually go through some information. So active reading is expected. I'm expected to read critically. How I'm expected to actually read critically is very difficult to convey, and it's a little hard. One moment, please. All right. So to get back to what I was saying, so active reading and comprehension is required, which is reading critically. We'll discuss how to do that, and analytical thinking and critical thinking. So analytical thinking and critical thinking, again, is described as a skill which will help us be better at all reading related information, or let's say all VARC or VALR, depending on which exam you're talking about. CAT, ZAT, doesn't matter, right? But all of our reading exams we'll get better at if we have this ability or this ability. But how do I get better at these abilities? Right? This is what I actually want to discuss. How do I make improvements that I'll actually get better at these abilities? Okay, so I want us to start with a few concepts, and then we can move ahead and actually solve some questions, and maybe all of you all can also tell me your doubts and interact. Just give me one moment. So yes, you can ask me your doubts over chat. you I would expect you have some doubts. So if you have those doubts, please ask them over chat. I expect you to subscribe, and you'll be required to subscribe to ask those doubts. Right. So to get back to what I was saying, now there are specific skills that we need to work on. So let me first start with a idea. Right. Let's say that any information that we interact with in the exam, it's a long passage. Let's say it's a 450 word passage. It's a 150 word passage, which is like a para summary question, right? Or it's a para jumble question type, right? These are different sentences 1, 2, 3, 4, and we are supposed to rearrange them into some new order. So we get information in this format in the exam, right? These are the three different formats in which we get text based information in the exam. Correct? Now, if we can reduce all of these to all of these different length write-ups, which is a 450 word write-up, a 150 word write-up, and again somewhere around 150 words split across 4 sentences, right? If we can reduce all of these to just this sentence about the topic, some specific topic, the author says something specific. If I can use actual words from the passage to fill these blanks, my clarity about the passage is radically improved, right? I know exactly why the author is trying to take up my time, or rather why the author is trying to give me any information. The reason why we look at it like why the author is trying to take up my time or why the author is giving me new information is this tells us the purpose of the author, right? So once we identify the purpose of the author for any given passage, so that would be your main point of the author, right? The purpose. The purpose tells us why the author wants to speak to us, right? This means about a certain topic, the author wants to say something specific. Both of these, if we can identify both of these blanks, our understanding of the passage would radically improve. All right. So, okay. So to get back to what I was saying, make sure that you make a note of this sentence about topic A, the author says B. We can apply this to any information that we get in the passage and in the exam, and if we can reduce each passage to this sort of brevity or this sort of length, our accuracy across these questions will improve. So keep this idea for a moment in your mind, right? Now let's start with some specific exercise. What I want us to do is I want us to go through this passage, and I want all of you all to figure out what you think about which words in the passage would go in blank A, which words in the passage would go in blank B. All right. So let's get started here. I just want all of you all to go through the passage and figure out what would go in blank A and blank B. Use words from the passage. All right. I'm just waiting for a while. I just want all of you to figure this out. This is really important for all of us to actually, this is a previous year passage. Some of you will identify this. This is really important because this will, like I said, if we can reduce a passage to just these two blanks, our accuracy across the VARC section or across the reading comprehension section is going to improve. And our ability to reduce each kind of passage to this sort of simplicity will determine our accuracy or our score in the exam. Please continue. So this is a really important exercise. All right. So to get back to what I was saying, I'm sure many of you have figured out what the subject of the passage is. So let's see how we figure this out for those of you who found this difficult. Like I said, this is a previous year question. This is actually a paragraph from a previous year RC, okay, a 2022 ZAT RC. All right. So let's see how we figure out what the main point of the author is by figuring out what blanks A and B say. So stupidity will often arise in cases like this when an outdated conceptual framework is forced into service, mangling the user's grip on some new phenomenon. Now, one of the things that I expect all of you all to encounter is you will realize that this is taken from somewhere in between, right? This had something that was stated prior to it, which made this section make sense, correct? But we don't have that information. So we have to build, like I said, context for information that we don't have any context for, correct? Let's see how we do this. Excuse me. So for each sentence, what I'm instead going to do is I'm going to identify the subject of each sentence, right? And we'll figure out what this leads us to. So let's say the first sentence Stupidity will often arise in cases like this when an outdated conceptual framework is forced into service, mangling the user's grip on some new phenomenon. Now, subject of the first sentence, like I said, think of this like we are trying to figure out one skill we are trying to get better at. One skill, not many multiple types of things. One skill that we are trying to get better at. Right? Keep this concept in mind. This is going to really help you with figuring out your reading comprehension part. So the first thing is that let's think of breaking down each of these into different sentences with each having a specific subject, right? Each sentence has based on our concept of subject predicate, but let's think of it simply like each sentence has a specific topic, right? So the topic of the first sentence is stupidity. Stupidity will often arise in some cases. So the first sentence is talking about stupidity, right? The second sentence, it is important to distinguish this from mere error. So subject is it. It being the distinction between stupidity and mere error. So the subject of the author in the second sentence. So first sentence subject was, first sentence subject was stupidity. Second sentence subject is distinguishing stupidity from error. Okay. Now, third sentence subject is we. We make mistakes of for all kinds of reasons, right? Stupidity is rather one specific and stubborn cause of error. So let's look at the next sentence. The subject of the next sentence is again stupidity. And the subject of the sentence after that is philosophers. And the subject of the sentence after that is stupidity. Let's mark these words. Okay. So let's see. Here our subject is philosophers, right? Historically, philosophers have worried a great deal about irrationality of not taking available means to achieve goals. Tom wants to get fit, yet his running shoes are quietly gathering dust. The stock solution to Tom's quandary is simple willpower. And again, we are back to the subject of the sentence being stupidity. Now, if you notice, I have sort of skipped a few sentences here. What made me skip a few sentences here? Right? And again, I want all of you to carefully think of what we're trying to do right now. We're trying to figure out one skill that will help us answer most of the questions that are thrown at us in the exam and accurately answer them, right? So the skill I'm talking about is identifying the subject, clearly identifying the subject of each sentence. And what does that reveal to us? What that reveals to me in this case, right, is that this information of we make mistakes for all kinds of reasons. Philosophers have worried a great deal about irrationality of not taking the means available. Then a specific example is given to us. Tom wants to get fit, yet his running shoes are quietly gathering dust. The stock solution to Tom's quandary is simple: willpower. Okay. So now the reason why I think this part is not that important, because this part, including we making mistakes for all kinds of reasons, is the author trying to simply tell us how common stupidity is, right? And what a so-called solution to stupidity is suggested as, correct? So all of this can be looked at as is trying to show us how common mistakes are or how common stupidity is, right? So it's trying to show us how common this phenomenon is. So we can simply say that this part of the passage is, let's call this an illustration, right? I'm including the philosopher's part, I'm including the Tom example, right? All of these clearly indicate that this is an illustration. All right. Now, stupidity is very different from this. It is rather a lack of. So now let's look at the subjects of the next sentences. Stupidity is very different from this. It is rather a lack of necessary intellectual equipment. So it refers to stupidity. Combating it will require XYZ, and such stupidity is perfectly compatible with intelligence. So let me just mark what the subject of each sentence would be, right? Stupidity, important to distinguish between stupidity and error, right? Then we make mistakes of all kinds. Stupidity is rather one specific cause of error. So let's say stupidity is specific cause of error. Correct. Stupidity is very different from something. It is rather lack of necessary means and combating it. Correct. So what my hypothesis here is, I just want all of you all to pay careful attention here, because this will, like I said, this skill will help us improve across our VARC section. So all of these words indicate the subject of each sentence. So this tells me that about the topic of stupidity, the author says when it arises, right? What leads to stupidity? So when it arises, what makes it a specific stubborn cause of error, right? Why is it a specific cause of error, and how to overcome it? If you notice the words in one of the sentences, as we are looking at the subject of each sentence we are trying to identify, eventually we came to this phrase combating it. Correct. Combating it is simply indicating to us that there is a way to overcome this stupidity, or there is a solution to the stupidity described in the passage. So my point is that the author has described a problem and given us a solution for that problem. So we can say the main point of the author can be described by this sentence. About the topic of stupidity, the author says when it arises, what makes it a specific stubborn cause of error. So what I meant by when I said that these sentences, let me mark them from here till here, are an illustration of what stupidity is not, right? Tom wants to, etc., etc. Philosophers have worried a great deal. So all of this is an example to tell us that stupidity is one specific stubborn cause of error. It's not a simple everyday error, right? It's a specific stubborn cause of error. Now the author uses this illustration to indicate something, and then tells us stupidity is actually very different from this. So the entire point of this illustration was to indicate what stupidity is not. Okay, then the author tells us how to combat it, and such stupidity is perfectly compatible with intelligence. Okay, so let me add something of value here first before we proceed to the question part of it. Let me add something of value here. Okay, one is, if you're practicing your reading comprehension part every day, suppose you're practicing your reading comprehension part every day for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, depends on different people, different types of time that they can allocate, right? I want you to first determine if your accuracy is really low, or your accuracy starts to fall the moment you try to really go fast or match the pace of the exam. What I want you to first go back and identify is, did you identify the main point of the author or the subject of the author carefully enough, right? Now, unless and until we identify the main point of the author, we should not proceed to questions, right? Because that way I don't have clarity about the passage. Look at the passage in the exam as, let's say, we see the passage in the exam as something really neat like this, right? Suppose when we read it for the first time, it becomes a mess, right? Our mind is trying to figure out, let's say this is the first reading, our mind is trying to figure out the context of the information we've read. And then we can eventually reach a stage where we understand some parts of the passage with absolute clarity, these being the main point of the author, right? And the other part of the passage is somewhat understood, right? We want to reach this stage before we start answering any kind of questions, right? Keep this concept in your mind that you want to reach this stage before you start answering any type of questions, ideally, right? Okay, so now if you're practicing every day, what I want all of you all to first start by doing is, especially for, let's take a passage where you've faced this problem, start by identifying the subject of each sentence, right? What is the main topic of each sentence? As sentences get long, right? As sentences get longer, let's say something like this. This would be considered one sentence, right? Along with this colon, because it's essentially one example included. So here the subject of the sentence is philosophers, what philosophers have worried about. Correct. So it's indicating to us what stupidity is, what stupidity is not. But the point is that the subject of this sentence is philosophers. It will be a little hard for us to identify, especially for some longer sentences for some students. So figure out the subject of each sentence. Based on this, you will be able to figure out what about the subject the author is trying to say. Right? This is what is our goal of our reading process. Right? And the skill that we are trying to develop, this brings me to my discussion today. The skill that we are trying to develop is to figure out the subject of each sentence and then sort of string those together in some logical concept. What about the subject is the author saying? If we can do this for any passage, and I assure you that we actually can, this is actually a simpler process than trying to figure out the meaning, the deeper meaning of the passage. Right? One of the things that happens when we start thinking about VRC is we get into this concept of I need to read critically, I need to think critically, I need to read in an active fashion, I need to read thoughtfully and critically. All of this gives us a feeling that you're supposed to do a deeper reading, which requires a long, like a investment of time, right? But I want us to rather look at it like identifying a pattern of subjects, right? Subjects of different sentences connected to each other. If you can see it as a pattern of different subjects connected to each other, you can identify a broader pattern, which is the main point of the author. Right? This is what I expect us to have the ability to do in any sort of a shortage of time environment, in long period of time environment, with any type of passage, right? Whether it may be a passage on history, economics, it could be a passage on any of these subjects. But I expect us to have the ability to do this for any type of a passage. Just give me one moment. Let me see if there are any. All right. So, okay. So now that I've done this, now I just want us to go through some specific exercise of subject and predicate. And this is not a grammar exercise. I'm not testing our grammar skills here. What I want to show to all of y'all is that one skill that we are trying to work on, which is identifying subject and predicate for each sentence in the passage. Right? Don't think of the reading process in the exam for now. For now, don't think of the reading process in the exam as a deeper understanding or a critical understanding of the passage, right? Don't think of it like that. All I want you to think of the passage is a set of a different pieces of information put together, given to us as a complete one set of information, right? With each subset having a separate subject, right? So I just want you to simply think of identifying the subjects of each of these sentences and the predicate. Predicate basically means what about the subject, right? So we simply need to identify these two for each of these sentences, right? And let's see what pattern emerges. So if we all invest the next 10 minutes, we are going to see how questions are constructed, how each question type can be solved using this concept of subject predicate, right? So let's invest a little bit of time and energy, everyone. Let's try and do this. Let's look at the first sentence, right? This is, by the way, this is the sentences that I'm showing you are based on a previous year question, right? So let's look at sentence number 5. For sentence number 5, what is the subject and what is the predicate? So even before the pandemic, parents around the world were growing more willing to pay for extra lessons in the hope of boosting their children's education, right? Okay, so I expect those of you who can probably type the answers for what is the subject and what is the predicate. But look at what we are talking about. Even before the pandemic, something took place with regards to someone. Even before the pandemic, parents around the world were taking some actions, right? So the subject of conversation is parents around the world. Predicate is what actions they were taking. They were more willing to pay, correct? So for this sentence, the subject is parents around the world, right? Or the doer or the action taker. Usually, I'm just trying to tell you simple ways to think of the subject, right? the concept, the main concept, etc. Right? So here it is parents around the world. Parents around the world were more willing to pay. Right? We are soon going to see how all of these connect to form one different type of question and how we can use it to solve every kind of question. Right? Keep this concept in mind. This is one skill that will help you solve all of your VARC questions with much more accuracy. Let's look at the next sentence. Sentence 4, the damage is almost certainly worse in places such as India and Mexico, where the disruption to schooling has been greater. Right? So, what is the subject in this case? What are we talking about? Those of you who are, I'm just going through the chat. Yes, here the subject is simple, the damage. Right? What we're talking about, the damage is what we're talking about, is almost certainly worse in places such as India and Mexico, where disruption to schooling has been much greater. Right? So the damage is being compared. The subject is the damage, and the damage has been compared to different locations, and the damage is to schooling. Correct? So subject would be the damage and is almost certainly worse in places such as XYZ where schooling has been greater. So we have so far identified the subjects of two sentences, sentence 5 and sentence 4. Let's look at the subject of sentence 3. The crisis will accelerate that trend. Now, this is clear. The subject here is the crisis. We don't need to spend time here. And will accelerate that trend. Correct? So, the crisis will accelerate that trend. The subject of conversation is the crisis. It will accelerate that trend. Now, let's look at sentence 2. As a new school year gets underway in many countries, the harm caused by months of closure is becoming ever clearer. So, just a moment. All right, so those of you who have figured out what sentence 2 is talking about from the point of view of subject and predicate, please type out your answers. Otherwise, I'll just explain this. So, yes, the previous sentence was much more easier. You're right. Now, sentence 2, as a new school year gets underway, this part of the sentence, some of you may think is the subject, right? But I want you to go back to sentence 5. If you remember in sentence 5, even before the pandemic, this is not the subject. This is just giving us the timeline when the subject, which is parents around the world, did some action. Correct? So the same way, here, new school year getting underway in many countries is just the setting in which the subject is going to take action. The subject is the harm caused by months of closure is becoming clearer. Right? So subject is the harm caused by months of closure is becoming clearer. All right. Sentence 1, in America, primary age pupils are on average 5 months behind where they would usually be in maths and 4 months in reading, according to McKinsey, a consultancy. All right. So I'll just go ahead and give the subjects. I think we need to speed up a little. So primary age pupils is the subject for this sentence. Primary age pupils are on average 5 months behind. And the information with regards to primary age pupils is the predicate. All right. So my objective of showing you that each sentence has a subject predicate is to then show you that the overall subject of conversation is student learning setbacks due to pandemic related school closures, right? How do we know this? Let's look at the subject of each sentence. Parents around the world were more willing to pay, right? This is taking place before the pandemic. The damage is certainly worse in different places. The crisis will accelerate that trend. The harm caused by months of closure and primary age pupils being 5 months behind. So this is an example, correct? The harm caused is an effect or outcome of the pandemic. The crisis is the pandemic. The damage is effect or outcome of the pandemic. Parents around the world more willing to pay are an effect, increased effect, growing more willing to pay, or an increased effect of the pandemic. So the subject of conversation is effects, setbacks or effects, negative effects due to pandemic. Correct? About this, the author is saying the harm caused is becoming clearer. right? We now know how much harm is caused. The harm caused is XYZ, 4 months behind, 6 months behind, 10 months behind, doesn't matter. But what the author is talking about, the subject is the negative impacts, plural impacts of the pandemic, the harm caused by the pandemic. Now, why is this important? This is a previous year parajumble question, right? We are expected to arrange this in a logical order. What is the logical order for these sentences to be written in, right? Let's try this. Now that we have figured this out, I want all of you all who are waiting to actually try and solve this previous year question, right? We'll see if this method is actually going to benefit you. We have identified the subject and predicate of each of these sentences. I just want you to figure out what you think is the correct sequence in this case, right? I'll again show you what is expected of us is to figure out the sequence. The subject and predicate are given here. What is the correct sequence for these sentences? I'll just wait for a minute or so. We have figured out the main point of the author here, right? This is the putting these two together are the main point of the author, right? So we can sort of figure out the ideal sequence. What is the correct sequence? I want all of you to think. This is a previous year parajumble question. What sequence would you fill in this case? All right. So I just want to move to the answer here. We can find ways to connect and make some sequence, right? We know that the discussion is effects of the pandemic, right? If you remember here, I told you we're looking at setbacks or negative impacts of the pandemic due to the pandemic, right? So we can say the main point of the author is discussing negative impacts of the pandemic becoming clearer to us, right? Okay, so clearer through all that data. Now let's see what connections we can make, right? So here we'll accelerate that trend, right? Accelerating that trend tells me prior to sentence 3, some trend is discussed, right? Which will then start moving faster, correct? Now the damage is almost certainly worse in places such as India and Mexico. This is a comparison, right? So this tells me that damage somewhere else in some other location would be discussed, right? Somewhere else. So sentence 5 does not discuss that. Sentence 3 does not discuss that. 2 does not discuss that. Sentence 1 discusses that. So I know that 1, 4 would then become a pair. They are comparing where all damage has taken place and to what degree it has taken place, correct? So 1, 4 is a pair. Now the crisis will accelerate that trend. What trend is that? We'll have to figure out. Now sentence 5 says even before the pandemic, parents around the world were more willing to pay for extra lessons, right? So if you notice that trend here, and the crisis will accelerate that trend, if you notice the words even before the pandemic, tells us that the trend is of parents growing more willing to pay. The crisis, which is the pandemic, will accelerate that trend, correct? So we have our sequence, which is 1, 4 are linked, right? And 5, 3 are linked, which is even before the pandemic, the crisis will accelerate that trend of parents growing more willing to pay, right? So these sentences are forming a mandatory pair. 1, 4, where a comparison is taking place, are forming a mandatory pair. One moment, right? 1, 4 is a mandatory pair. And sentence 2, as a new school year gets underway, the harm caused is becoming ever clearer. Ever clearer is clearer across these 4 sentences. From sentence 1 here to sentence 3, this is becoming clearer to us, which is the harm caused by the pandemic is becoming clearer to us. So 21453 is the correct sequence. This is a previous year question. If you notice, 21453 tells us the story of student learning setbacks, negative impacts due to the pandemic, right? And the predicate, which is the harm caused by months of closure, is becoming clearer. Likha tha yahan pe. Clearer how? I said clearer like across the 4 sentences mentioned here, which is significant learning gaps, primary age pupils falling behind an average, etc. Right? Which is what is stated here, learning gaps, etc. Excuse me. So my point is that if we identify the subject of each sentence, our ability to piece that information together becomes that much more clearer, right? So the one skill, I'm just going to bring our discussion to an end in 2 more minutes. So the one skill that we need to get better at is to identify the main point of the author, right? Now, that one main point we can identify if we can identify the subject and predicate of each sentence. For example, now what I've done is, and again, those of you who are watching right now, please rewatch this video because this is really a skill that one skill that if you work on, your accuracy will improve, is this identifying subject and predicate of each sentence. What I've done is I've pieced together these sentences into an actual passage, which is this passage, right? It's talking about the impacts of the pandemic. This is, if I'm not mistaken, taken from Eon by Zat, right? This is Zat 2022, if I'm not mistaken, right? But it's definitely a Eon passage. All right. So the point is that here we can now ask a question based on this passage, which is what can be inferred about the educational impact of pandemic in countries like India and Mexico compared to America, right? Now, what if we had done while reading this passage is if we had put together the subject predicate of each of these sentences, we would get a idea of what the main point of the author is, which is the harm by the pandemic, which is becoming ever clearer, right? Once we figure this part out, every other piece of information that is given to us can be then put in that perspective. Meaning that if you look at an inference about educational impact of pandemic in different countries, we know why this information was given in the passage. The information was given to indicate clearly how and where damage is taking place. So we know why the information is being given to us. And that way we can measure or we can determine its importance for different questions, right? This information about India and Mexico versus America is not really important for the main point of the author, but it's important for specific questions like this, right? Here, the correct answer would be option C, right? In each of these options, if you notice, A and B, primary age pupils are more affected. In America, more affected is incorrect. The disruption to schooling has been less severe in India is incorrect. That would be opposite. Parents are unwilling to pay, incorrect. The harm caused by school closure is less clear, incorrect, right? So the correct answer is option C. The educational damage in India and Mexico is likely more severe. This is based on the word is almost certainly worse, correct? So more severe based on the word worse. Option C is the correct choice, right? The other question type that we could create from this passage would be, which of the following, if true, would the author most likely disagree with regards to education in today's world, right? Which of the following would the author disagree with? And if you notice these options, I'll just pause for a moment. I wanted to go through the options and think of what the answer could be. The options are not options stated in the passage. This kind of a question has been asked before. All right, these are not options stated in the passage. So, which of the following, if true, would the author most likely disagree with regarding education in today's world? Supplemental education resources have become more important. They will become more important because there is disruption to schooling. Pandemic has underscored importance of having robust digital infrastructure, correct, because there is disruption to schooling. So the author will agree with these. The author will not disagree. We are looking for a option the author will disagree with, right? Teachers have played a crucial role in mitigating educational damage. This could be true. The author could disagree with this, agree with this. We can't be sure. Let's look at option D. Educational policymakers need to implement targeted interventions. Targeted interventions is correct, right? Because we need to avoid disruption to schooling in specific age, in specific parts of the world. So targeted interventions is correct. So we are left with E. Online learning platforms have completely eliminated the educational setbacks caused by the pandemic, ensuring that all students are on track. Now, this is have learning platforms have completely eliminated the risk, the setbacks. Clearly, the author is describing the setbacks due to the harm, right? The harm caused. The setbacks due to the pandemic, not due to the harm, right? So, E is something that the author will disagree with. All right. So, to come back to what I was trying to tell all of y'all is, if we work on subject and predicate of each sentence, we can actually clearly figure out what any type of passage is about. Many of us face challenges in reading some specific type of passages. For example, students find philosophical passages quite tricky, or economics passages quite tricky. All of those will become approachable and solvable if you manage to identify subject and predicate of each sentence and sort of piece together what the author is trying to say overall. Not only will this improve your ability to solve any type of question, it will also improve your ability to solve application based questions, right? Author's agreement, author's disagreement, all of those question types you'll get better at. So when you're actually practicing your VRC or you're practicing for reading comprehensions, I expect you to allocate some specific time to breaking down passages on this level, right? This, now many of you will, just a few points to cover, many of you will feel like this can't be done in the exam, and you're right, it can't be done in the exam, but you need to develop these fundamentals so your reading process in the exam will be similarly logical, right? So it's something that we have to actually develop and practice and then learn to apply it at speed in the exam, right? Okay. So make sure you practice this. I have another class dedicated to this, and based on how the class went, etc., I have some changes that I'll incorporate in the next class. I hope this class has been useful. There are a few key things I need to communicate. There are some questions which are left not discussed. I'll cover them in the next class. But we have a few more sessions lined up for all of y'all, and these sessions are we have a session on 11th July at 8:30, and this is about how to analyze mocks. Analysis is really important. This will actually tell you what your awqat is basically, right? So you need to know where you stand, and analysis is very important. So make sure that you watch this series, and there is another 90-day strategy. You need to figure out your strategy for the days to come. So we have these two classes scheduled in the days to come, right? So before I bring the class to an end, I'm just saying this before our next class. Make sure that you're working on one specific skill right now, and that skill, I don't want you to try and apply it actually live during the mock test or during the exam. I just want you to make sure you follow a specific reading process for the passage, and we'll work on this based on today's class, and we'll work on this in the next class. I have a few questions planned. So by the way, I hope this class is actually useful. I hope you share this with some people and maybe leave some feedback so we can work on this and we can get better at these type of interactive classes, right? Something that is not specific to solving questions, but working on some specific skills that we could improve on. All right. So with this, let me bring today's discussion to an end. Thank you everyone for being patient and listening and contributing. I will bring the class to an end. All right. Thank you.